From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We are joined as always with our super producer, Alexis, codenamed Doc Holliday Jackson. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. I'd like to start out today's episode with a shout out to our good pal, Jack O'Brien, creator of Crack.com, as well as creator and co-host of the Daily Zeitgeist. Jack and I were talking on Twitter a little bit about today's episode. This is our update on something we've done recently, and maybe the best way to get into it is to say life is tough in public service. If you are a firefighter, a teacher, a public defender, or even a diplomat, thank you for your service. You know that there's a ton of stuff you have to deal with every day that just doesn't get much media attention. And so in the world of foreign service, a question people have been asking in the U.S. is, what happens when a disease seems made just for you? What happens when the only demographic indicator for some kind of affliction isn't your, it's not your makeup necessarily, it's entirely your employment? A job based on disease. This is a question we touched on in the past, from explorations of tailor-made diseases to the inexplicably efficient curses like bone pointing in Australia and Papua New Guinea. Today, we're diving into a new iteration of this phenomenon, folklore that's occurring as we record. It's something the world is still trying to figure out. It's something called the Havana syndrome. Here are the facts.
Well, the Havana syndrome is currently being described as a, quote, set of medical symptoms with unknown causes. If there's a description that's any more vague and amorphous than that, I would love for you to show it to me. A syndrome being a kind of catch-all of a group of symptoms, a series of kind of interrelated maladies, sort of like, Ben, as you put it, a extra value meal. Remember when they used to call them extra value meals? Do they still call them that? Yeah, that was a thing.
Probably.
A combo. Not necessarily one singular condition with a singular cause. It is inherently vague and kind of, a little bit mysterious, the idea of a syndrome, the China syndrome, for example, Yeah,
and this particular syndrome is pretty strange. It's got a lot of different symptoms. You'll hear a lot about migraines, about brain fog, tiredness, and inability to complete simple tasks for your job, especially, as a diplomat, just simple things at your computer or sending emails, making phone calls, things like that. There's other things too. Hearing clicking, ringing in the ears. It's a whole bunch of weird stuff going on at one time.
Yeah. Tinnitus, the sensation of pressure or vibration in one's head, and of course, nausea, lack of coordination, things like that. It is a panoply of symptoms, right? And this, again, seems to primarily target government officials, members of the intelligence community in the U.S., and a couple folks in Canada where this was first reported. But particularly when they're operating abroad, right? Yes, exactly. So this is not happening in Langley. Very important note. So first things first, and I am so glad that we are returning to this. We talked about it in Strange News. We talked about it in a previous episode. But one thing we didn't point out, regardless of what you think of Havana syndrome, after hearing our show today, we need to agree on this one thing. The name is utter bull. And it's unfair. It's like, it's called the Havana syndrome only because the first publicly acknowledged reports surfaced amid U.S. and Canadian embassy staff in Havana, Cuba. And that's similar to the way the world did Spain so very dirty with the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. It didn't come from Spain. It's called the Spanish flu because Spain, out of all the countries, did the right thing and did not suppress reports of a deadly influenza virus spreading.
Yeah, but we also know that, like, I mean, these types of names have political clout to them, or they're a political capital in some ways. Like, you know, how Donald Trump very desperately tried to rebrand COVID-19 to the Chinese flu or the China virus or whatever. You know, the idea of calling it the Havana syndrome in some way sort of displaces the blame or kind of, you know, makes people think of it in a certain light. You know, similarly to the Spanish flu. Even though it wasn't necessarily something that was caused by Spain, as in the case of the Havana syndrome, not necessarily caused by, you know, the government of Cuba per se. It's still a little up in the air. But also, I just want to backtrack really quickly. I said at the beginning of the show when describing what a syndrome was, I dropped the term China syndrome, which is a movie about a nuclear meltdown, not a disease. But the word syndrome, it's so amorphous and catch-all that it can also refer to just like a set of circumstances. Like not in my backyard syndrome is what Wikipedia puts it. So there are lots of ways of using syndrome, and in and of itself is kind of like the vaguest of possible catch-all terms.
Just for my money, guys, Havana syndrome does make sense because it was the American embassy in Havana, Cuba, where it originated, right? Where we first noticed it and reports first came out, at least. But I think we should call it the Moscow Signal 2.
There you go.
I like that. That's foreshadowing, Matt.
I completely agree.
So, but I think we are making an important point. You know, the government of Cuba, as we said earlier, likely has nothing to do with this. And they're probably rightly a little peeved that the name of the capital of their country is now attached to an amorphous thing that people consider either a possibly a disease or injury from some sort of sci-fi level directed energy weapon. But what you call it if you live in Cuba? You know what they call it? They don't call it. This is like the what do you call a quarter pounder conversation, right? In Cuba, if you are working in this field, or if you're working in the field of medicine, etc., you will probably not call it. Well, you'll definitely won't call it Havana syndrome. You'll probably call it unidentified health incidences, or UHI. It's our new addition to all the unidentified things we love. Unidentified submerged objects, unidentified aerial phenomenon. Now we have unidentified health incidents. Less sexy, less provocative, much more accurate. But maybe we talked about this when the news was breaking, but maybe we should start by doing a quick recap of what went down in Cuba, which, by the way, I love that we have a job where I can say sentences like that at work. Like, maybe let's start with what went down in Cuba.
All right. Well, yeah, we first learned about it in 2017 when the first reports began coming out. But we do know that it was in 2016 when diplomats and people working there in Havana, Cuba, noticed that something was happening. They were experiencing symptoms. And let's see, what was it? There were 21 individuals initially, I think, or around 21 individuals, or at least 21 that were acknowledged of having symptoms in 2017 when those reports first came out. But then in 2018, it was up to 26 individuals. And that's really what we would call the original class of people, group of people who were affected by this. Yeah.
And then just like maybe a contagious or transmissible disease, this syndrome, reports of it at least, quickly expanded to other locations across the planet with one commonality. It seemed to exclusively affect U.S. government personnel, like people living in the neighborhood of embassies, nationals in, say, China or Taiwan or something. They weren't being affected. The people reporting this were virtually all working for Uncle Sam. And the New York Times... that
just been really quickly, that has expanded to some families of diplomats now and intelligence agents. Yeah.
Yes, that is correct. And that's a very important point. But the point still holds that people who are not working with or in relationships with these people, but were living in the same geographic area, were not infected, which is not the way transmissible disease usually works, right? A disease or an infection does not necessarily care what kind of job you have. And that's already, curiouser and curiouser, as Lewis Carroll would say. New York Times had a great article on this, summing up some of the events. And they said that the way they put it is in 2016, 2017, those 21 folks that you mentioned, Matt, they started to report neurological symptoms. These were serious. These weren't just, bouts of migraine headaches that come and go. In some cases, the people involved seemed debilitated, and they had no real explanation for what was happening. And some of them, or actually the majority of the original folks, said these symptoms were preceded by a high-pitched piercing sound, which they reported differently. They have varying kind of interpretations or recollections of what they heard, but they felt like they had walked through a, quote, invisible beam of energy. This is under the Trump administration, and the Trump administration reacted quickly. 15 Cuban diplomats, foreign officers got kicked out of D.C., and then the White House also moved the majority of its staff out of the embassy in Havana.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a really cool New Yorker piece about this by Adam Entus and John Lee Anderson called The Mystery of the Havana Syndrome. And one of the central characters or figures, I guess, in it was a career diplomat named Audrey Lee. And she described on March 17th of 2017, she came home from working at the embassy and made supper for her family. She had twins, or has twins, and her husband, who was not there at the time, he was away on business of his own. And then she started experiencing those symptoms that you're talking about. She described it as feeling as though she had been, what was the word she used? Like something had struck her. She had been struck. That's how she described it. And she felt this burst of pressure in her head and then stabbing sensations, very, very, very painful, she described. And it was determined by her, based on these rumors, I guess, that at the time were rumors around the embassy, that these were due to some kind of attack of some sort, some sort of sonic weapon. And the reason I get to this is she overheard, it was such common knowledge around the embassy that she actually heard security guards kind of having a conversation about it and saying the phrase, "Get off the X." That was what really hit me. There's a really good NBC mini doc about this as well. You can look it out on YouTube. But that refers to the idea of this being a localized thing. Move off the X. If you're feeling these symptoms, move to a different area where maybe it'll go away because whatever's affecting you isn't there. And she did that, and she felt better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is important, too, because there's a point you brought up that I want to kind of highlight, which is the role of communication. There is validation in all communication, or in, effective communication. And that's something we're going to see play out in a big, big way here. So since those initial reports in Cuba, more reports came in. People in Russia, people in Georgia, the country, people in Poland, Taiwan, Australia, Colombia, Kyrgyzstan, Austria. I thought you would like that one, Matt. Of course, Austria, Uzbekistan, yep. and China. And these reports will probably continue coming in. We don't know, given some of the necessary secrecy around some of these events, we probably won't know for a while the full number of people who believe that they have been affected by this. And the U.S. government has, at this time, not released any official tally of the number of people reporting these symptoms. The closest you can find is some reports in U.S. media, like in September of 2021, NPR had a piece on on the CIA chief in Vienna getting recalled because of the way he was handling this. And they noted that there are currently an estimated 200 plus cases around the world. In a world of almost 8 billion people, that's not a lot. But in the world of, in this rarefied air of diplomacy and intelligence and all of that spooky stuff, 200 plus is a lot of people. It's enough that you'd be worried if you worked at an embassy.
Well, I think that's the story, how this came back into our lives because of that small, the stories that Jim sent in about Vienna. Then we had that tiny little piece that was like, oh yeah, it's happening in Vienna now too. And now we're here talking about it again because I didn't realize personally how far this thing had spread. As Ben just described, there are all these different countries. You'll even see it being reported. I think there's a one-off case that occurred in Vietnam when current Vice President Kamala Harris was visiting in Vietnam, and then one of her staff that was there was along with her was affected by this.
Yeah,
crazy.
Yeah, you're right, and that interfered with the VP's trip as well because they wanted to err on the side of caution, which makes sense. At this point, folks, Havana syndrome, whatever it is or is not, it doesn't appear to be lethal, which is good news. What we mean is no one has died as a result of this set of ill-defined, get it? Ill-defined symptoms.
Yet.
Yet. It's very important. It's a very important figure to raise there. But here's the strangest part. It's a question we asked in our previous episode on this. What exactly is Havana syndrome? Aside from the terrible branding of the name, what's causing it? Multiple individuals right now, scientists, and several individuals in the employ of the government, a really cool group called the Jasons. Mm-hmm. They all will tell you that they are pretty conclusive on the answer, but there's a big problem here. They don't agree with each other. There is no official conclusion yet. There are a lot of officials who have reached conclusions, and these conclusions contradict. So what's really going on? We're going to pause for a word from our sponsor, and then we're diving in. Here's where it gets crazy. Okay, this is something we also need to talk about, and it's something that I know the three of us have talked about pretty often off air and maybe on air a little bit too. There is a dangerous potential side effect anytime an official makes a conclusion on their own, right? Like if a president, if a police chief, if an ambassador, what have you, states their opinion as a conclusion or says, I believe this, then that opinion or that personal conclusion can be confused with an actual official conclusion. This means that if you were just to watch one person talking on one news report, or you read one article, one statement by, say, I don't know, like a CIA chief in Vienna or something, you might think that the case is wrapped up, but you probably don't know the whole story. That's why we're still doing this episode today, because it gets so weirdly complicated. Experts disagree. And when we say experts, we mean like the experts, capital T, capital E.
So we talked about this before, the idea of directed energy attacks. I used the phrase earlier, sonic weapon, which again is another kind of like vague sci-fi catch-all kind of term that was used in that New Yorker article. But what is a directed energy weapon? Microwaves is one of the most plausible causes identified by a National Academies of Science report that was commissioned by the Department of State. But initially, they'd floated out the idea that this could be that aforementioned sonic weapon, which we'll get to in just a sec. And this is also a reason that you'll find some folks that believe that this is some sort of example of mass hysteria, a psychosomatic phenomenon where people observe others freaking out, and essentially it becomes contagious. this idea of mimicking the behavior of others, or it becoming, in some way a thing that can spread, like a Salem witch trials kind of thing, or a satanic panic type of situation. So these are the two kind of big buckets of explanations for these symptoms. And currently, very important members of the same governments seem to not be on the same page about which of these it is at all.
Yeah. Well, and you could, hopefully you can see why these are the two prevailing things, right? Just due to the nature of some of these symptoms, you can imagine why any expert who's imagining the possible tech out there that could cause something like this, you go to, okay, it's something that's using sound waves that would account for the high pitched, stuff going on with the ears and how it affects the brain that way, or it's microwaves, because we've seen this kind of thing before. Ben and Noel, I think the big issue here is the word weapon. I think that's where we're getting tripped up on all this, where someone who's on the highly skeptical side saying this is this is psychosomatic because that kind of weapon doesn't exist. I think that's the problem, weapon, because this kind of tech exists, just not as a directed weapon that you would fire at an adversary.
Right. Like the first thing you want to find in a murder is the murder weapon, right? Or it's one of the first things you want to find. So the big question, this is a question Jack and I had as well, is like, where is the weapon, right? If we know this kind of technology exists, but due to the nature of it, and we talk a little bit about the possible physics here in our previous episode, due to the nature of it, you can get a kind of spider sense for where this thing, like the distance within which it would have to be located to have these effects on people. Again, all theoretical at this point. But that didn't stop people like Christopher Miller, who was a former Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration, for claiming publicly this was a directed energy weapon. He also called it an act of war. This is #NoChill, by the way. And multiple former and current members of the intelligence community appear to agree in an apolitical way. We're talking about people you might consider being left-wing, people you might consider being right-wing, who usually disagree about everything, right? This camp has both of those folks in it. And most of the people who believe it was a directed energy weapon also believe Russia is behind the syndrome. Spoiler alert, Russia denies any involvement.
When do they ever cop to anything, though? Oh, man. Yeah.
Yeah,
Russia.
but it's funny. Like this is terrible to say, but with polonium assassinations, that was pretty much copping to involvement, Yeah. Also, if you're listening to Russia, stay away from the windows.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But it may very well not be Russia at all. We got to keep that as a possibility, even though, as we're going to get into, there's some precedent. But okay, let's continue.
And I am not trying to disparage the average Russian citizens out there who may not be listening to this show. I just think Russia as a government has a history of being pretty tricksy. I think we can all kind of agree on that. Not that we don't, but they sort of pride themselves on, admitting nothing. So it just doesn't really surprise me there. But there's a lot of dissent as well, voices of dissent. Some people believe that this is the result of some sort of intentional attempt to harm intelligence officials, which is what we've talked about. But others think it's some sort of side effect of some high-tech attempt to steal classified intelligence from phones and computers. So perhaps a proximity effect from some technology that's being used within the agency.
As Ben said, it can also be stolen from Windows, not the software, the hardware.
Right. And then what's interesting about that too is just so we all have a scope of how advanced some of that observational technology can be. It's totally possible to hear a conversation by aiming a laser at a window, and the people in the room with the window will be discernible. So like, it's not out of the realm of possibility, as space age as it sounds. One thing we mentioned.
You do the same thing with radio frequencies too, by the way.
Yes.
Is there a name for it? There's a name for that piece of equipment. It's called like a something catcher or like a something fisher. There's names for there's a name for a piece of equipment like that you can literally use to like intercept radio frequencies or cell phone conversations. But I think I maybe misspoke earlier when I was saying that this maybe would have been as a result of stuff being used within the embassy. This would have been stuff that was being targeted at the embassy to try to steal their intel. Correct?
Yeah, but it could have been with that explanation, or in that case, it could be possible that there was an inside person who like set the thing up. No one knows. Well, yeah. If it's true, someone knows. No one publicly knows. So
they're not saying.
They're not saying. That's right. They have not made an official statement. So if you are diving into this, one of the first questions you're going to ask is rightly, if it's a weapon, where's the weapon? But another question we need to ask immediately is, if there are symptoms, what are the symptoms, and can we find physical traces of those? This is where the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, comes into play. In 2018, they published a study. I alluded to this when we were talking about this earlier, led by a guy who's pretty legit. His name is Douglas H. Smith. He's the director of the Center for Brain Injury and Repair at University of Pennsylvania. And his team looked at people reporting these symptoms, and they found signs of brain damage, but they found no signs of impact to the patient's skull. And they used a really weirdly poetic term for this. They called this kind of trauma an immaculate concussion. And
that's
I
clever.
know, what an album name. And so Smith also said most of the folks on his team were pretty skeptical about this going in. And then later they all unanimously concluded something is there. So much so that they did another study the next year in 2019, and they largely agreed with their earlier findings.
That is fascinating. I mean, we're going to get to the whole idea of like mass hysteria and what that means, but this stuff sure points the finger at something. We don't quite know what that is.
Well, yeah, if there's brain damage involved, I mean, and you can measure
touchless
it.
brain damage, you know what I mean? Like an unseen mover causing people's brains to malfunction.
Just wait until their white blood cell levels are heightened in the next couple of years.
And I think we maybe brushed over it a little bit, or maybe not, but like, I mean, one of the big things that was described here is the idea of brain fog and of not being able to like read things, you know, like the woman that I described, Miss Lee, in the New Yorker piece, she at breakfast with her kids, like couldn't read the cereal box and things like that. Like these sort of like bursts of, confusion and this sort of like, you know, almost like borderline stroke-like symptoms, you know, like where you like kind of just like are all of a sudden like in a fugue state.
Yeah. And this, I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Matt, like one of the key things is, temporary inability to accomplish relatively simple tasks. Let's go into this. Let's go into the idea of something being psychogenic or psychosomatic, Attic insane. There's the other side of the camp. The other contradictory information here, or contradictory belief, is a growing number of people, also high-level experts, also high-level scientists, think that this is quite possibly entirely psychosomatic. What does that mean? Well, first, it does not mean that people are purposely making something up. It does not mean that they are lying, and it does not mean that their experiences are invalid. It means that while people may genuinely believe they've been affected by some sort of James Bond level spy machinery, they have instead succumbed somehow to an outbreak of mass hysteria. And shout out to the excellent book, Outbreak. If you would like to learn more about this, it's the best encyclopedia I've found of mass hysteria outbreaks throughout history. It is such a good and disturbing read.
It's one of those things that almost is connected to like the placebo effect, where if you truly believe that you're getting the right medication or something that's supposed to have an effect, then you can trick your body into experiencing a positive result. And I believe there's the opposite of that called the nocebo effect, where you can literally trick your body into being sick, which, in this scenario is kind of what this would be if people truly believe, based on, remember all that communication you were talking about, Ben, and overhearing kind of the scuttlebutt around the embassy about sonic weapons and hearing whispers of all this kind of stuff. If you really believe that you're being targeted by this and you start to hear other people that validate your belief, then it can make it persevere and maybe even get more intense.
Can I tell you guys, I want to comment on this? No, you're right. A couple of days after we recorded that episode featuring the stories from Vienna, where we brought Havana syndrome back up, I think I experienced something kind of like this, where I was thinking about it a lot. I was talking about it with you guys, and then talking about it with a couple other friends. And late at night, when I was just hanging around in my house, I was in my bedroom, and I heard a clicking sound in my right ear. I'm not kidding. And then a high pitched tone, like tinnitus, like I get when I'm playing cymbals too much or something. And it lasted for quite a while. I felt nauseous, and I had to lay down, and I felt really weird. And I don't know if it's possible that my brain could just cause these effects to occur because I've been thinking about it and talking about it a lot. I don't know what happened within my brain when I experienced it, but I know I experienced something like it. And I highly doubt that I'm being targeted, that my house is being targeted for any reason. So I'm just putting it out there that, like, you may think that, oh, that's impossible. My brain could never, like, trick itself into experiencing something, but I just would say to you, it can. And it feels very weird when you identify that it has.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, it goes back to, in some ways, it's like a version of peer pressure, right? Like that experiment I talked about earlier, where it was clear that people will make a inaccurate or incorrect conclusion just so they can fit in with a group. Like which line is longer, which line is the same length. That's scary, and it's very human. Other historical examples of mass psychogenic illnesses or phenomena would be stuff like the dancing plagues of the Middle Ages, or our episode on the screaming epidemics in rural Malaysia. Or for something more recent, what about the various accounts of teenagers developing facial tics after watching a lot of videos of someone with Tourette's syndrome on TikTok? There's a level of communication here that is maybe not entirely consensual, is what I'm saying. The anti-weapon school of thought, let's call them that, found some pretty high-level proponents, and this is this is a story that I think is funny. I don't know if we need to go too deep on this, but it's interesting because it's a great illustration of how science should work. The initial claims of sonic weapons. This came about because a lot of the victims' description included those noises, similar to what you're mentioning, Matt. Not everyone reported hearing a sound. Not everyone said they heard the same thing, but still, that's a good place to start. So were these folks in Cuba hearing a weapon? Various physicists have shot this down. Dr. Jürgen Altmann, particular, stood out to me. He said, "I know of no acoustic effect that can cause concussion symptoms. Sound going through the air cannot shake your head." And then there was an alleged recording of the sonic attack. Cool. That's evidence, right? That's like the recording of a gunshot if there is a weapon in play. But some biologists got in the game. They investigated this, and they were able to conclusively identify the sound. It wasn't a sonic weapon. Well, it wasn't a man-made sonic weapon. It was the banging tunes of the humble Aneurogryllus celerinictus, a loud cricket. A very, very loud cricket. Look upon my chirps, ye mighty, is basically what happened.
Those cricket legs are deadly.
I know. They're like the world's tiniest violin playing the saddest song en masse. But no, I mean, anyone that lives around the neck of the woods that we're in, you know this sound. Or at least cicadas and crickets, they make a similar sound. And it's a giant group of them. And it creates something that the ear perceives as being a kind of a continuous kind of hum, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we go to Fernando Montealegre Zapata, who's a professor of sensory biology at the University of Lincoln. And this guy was involved in the study the biologist conducted, and he confirmed that this is a Caribbean species of cricket. Its call is going through at about 7 kilohertz, and it's at a high rate, which means if you're walking around rocking human general issue ears, you're going to hear a continuous sharp trill when these crickets are emitting their calls. So they're not super spies. They're just very loud. They don't have indoor voices. That's what happened. And it's
interesting if you've got a loud enough, sound at the same frequency occurring for a long enough period of time, it can cause hearing damage. And some of those things, those sensations, like losing a frequency or two in your ears. That could be part of the problem, maybe.
Yeah,
right?
And doesn't that often, like, when you lose that frequency, then you get tinnitus, like in that frequency where you hear it constantly?
It's possible.
That's true, and that's a valid point. Counterpoint, I would say, why did no one in Havana report that before?
Agreed.
Well, and to your earlier point, Ben, about the proximity effect, right? Or like if short of these devices being stationed directly in the homes of these individuals that were being, afflicted, what about the people standing in between? You know what I mean? What about the people in the streets? Yeah. What about the other people living in the neighborhoods and nearby houses that these would presumably maybe pass through? That's the part. Again, because the technology is so... We don't know what this is, so we don't know what the mechanism of targeting would be and how to even deploy it. So I think that's what causes a lot of like head scratching, at least in like with the people that are able to talk about it. I mean, maybe this does exist and there's just like a small cadre of folks that know about what this is, but we can't hear about it.
A conspiracy of crickets. I love it.
There you go.
Ben, what if the crickets can send that 7 kilohertz signal, bounce it off the windows, and then record it in their little cricket robot bodies?
Are you saying crickets aren't real?
Let me get my Matrix glasses out. I saved them for this one. So, yes.
I'm joking.
Man. All right. Well, I'm putting away the glasses then. So we ruled out one possible explanation. Crickets are probably not super spies. But what about the other possibilities? To answer that, we have to turn on the microwave after a word from our sponsors. Beep, beep, beep. No, Doc, don't cut those beeps. We're doing a bit. A microwave, but for your mind. One of the strongest supporting...
A mind-crowave?
There it is.
Oh,
there it is.
Sorry.
Cut print. No, that's perfect. A microwave. Brilliant. So one of the strongest arguments for the idea of a directed energy weapon and the idea that Russia might be behind it is something that you mentioned earlier, Matt, the Moscow signal.
Dude.
What is that?
A messed up thing that you barely hear about. Like, I barely know about this. And I'm so interested in this stuff, and I barely know about it. Because I've never had proximity to the State Department, I suppose. I don't know. But it's an older story from, I want to say the 1970s, Ben. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just pulling this from the top of my head. I think it was 1970s in Moscow at an embassy there, and in a couple other places in Moscow where Americans were operating. Is that right?
God. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the thing I remember, Ben, is a specific listening device that was placed in a couple, like within the walls of a building where diplomats were were functioning that required, I think it was microwaves, to be sent into the building to activate the listening devices. I think that's what it is. You tell me the actual story, Ben. That's just what I remember.
Well, first, we're not experts on this, but this is not a classified thing any longer. I think, Noel, Matt, I think first off, most importantly, we can agree that the Moscow Signal is a great name for a band, and their debut album is Immaculate Concussion.
I love it.
Right?
Also, either of those could be a good name for a nice stiff cocktail.
That's true. I would be frightened of a cocktail called Immaculate Concussion.
I'll have yours then, Ben.
Okay, well, you have two, and I'll drive because I don't think you could drive after those. But yes, so the Moscow Signal is public knowledge now. To the point that there is a Wikipedia page on this that you can read that has some pretty good sourcing, which you can't always say about Wikipedia. So this describes a microwave transmission that was directed at the U.S. Embassy, and as Matt said, probably some other places as well, starting in at least 1953 and going to about 1979. It was around for a long time. And I need to lean on you guys for a little bit of a comparison description of how this signal was rated. So the Moscow Signal over those decades is varying between 2.5 to 4 gigahertz. And that cricket over there, terrorizing the embassy in Cuba, allegedly, is calling at about 7 kilohertz. So what's the difference here? What gives? How do they compare?
Well, typically, like something that would be considered high frequency in sound waves would be something between 30 kilohertz and 300 megahertz. So what you're describing is a little below that. And for reference, Matt, what is the typical range of the ability of human ears to perceive sound in frequencies?
My understanding is 20 hertz on the low end to like the super low frequencies, all the way up to about 20 kilohertz, which would be 20K when I'm thinking about it in my editing brain.
Got it. Awesome. Okay. Plus, I love the idea. I love the idea of this cricket talking. For some reason, when you guys are describing this to me, it makes me think of the cricket as some insect version of those screaming goats. Have you ever seen those? That they're like eerily human-like in their bleats. I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you over the weekend because I don't think you want to hear it on a school night.
And just for a little reference for like your own personal hearing, the human voice, a male voice, covers a fundamental frequency range of between 100 hertz and 900 hertz. And, you know, once we get past the range of human hearing, when we start getting into things like megahertz and gigahertz, between 300 megahertz and 300 gigahertz is considered microwaves. And above that, between 300 gigahertz and 400 terahertz, that's infrared, and then you start getting into the visible light spectrum. So all of these things are related.
So we're talking about 2.5 to 4 gigahertz with this Moscow signal, and that's definitely microwaves. That's definitely, you're not going to hear it necessarily, but you could be affected by it theoretically. And I just last thing on that 7 kilohertz thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, Noel, but when I'm going through and using a de-esser on somebody's voice, generally it's around 7 kilohertz, which might make you like understand why that cricket sound is so jarring and so like irritating, because that's the thing that many audio professionals remove from speaking voices, just because it's kind of it's the sibilance. It's sometimes the hard S that you hear. They take like that's the thing that's just coming at you from several 100,000 crickets or whatever.
Yeah, and I felt a disturbance in the sound as though a million crickets cried out at once. So later, the U.S. government will conclude that the Moscow signal is likely an attempted espionage, and in this conclusion, they also determined that there were no ill health effects on their staff as a result. 40 years after the fact, this would be disputed, which is important. You can find a report on this called the Moscow Signal Epidemiological Study 40 Years On by Jose A. Martinez from Reviews on Environmental Health. So people are still debating that one decades later. Here's the big problem we mentioned already with the microwave proposal. No one's found the weapon. No one has found the microwave. If these are purposeful attacks, I would say it's also interesting that no one has determined a solid motive. Would you blast people's brains just to like troll them?
Right.
It's not, there's no indication that this was pushing them to perform certain tasks.
Yeah, exactly.
But still, the inescapable fact is that the Moscow Signal was a real thing, and this plays a big role in the minds of people who argue that there are current microwave attacks. But then
I have to say, I have to slightly disagree. Just slightly disagree. I think there's clear motive with the Moscow signal, which was signals intelligence on the behalf of, an opposition force to the United States. In this case, it was likely Moscow, or it was likely the Russian government. And they were blasting microwaves at embassy locations, at diplomatic locations, in order to gain intel by using devices theoretically inside that building. We know for sure there was one and several others, the typewriters that were discovered. And we know that for sure. Like, you can head on over to, I think it's the American Foreign Service Association website. Ben, you posted a link there. The title is "Today's Havana Syndrome is like deja vu all over again," as Yogi Berra might have put it. Ha ha ha, by James Shoemaker.
I'm not saying that the Moscow Signal didn't have a motive. I think that's very clear.
But then I think, I don't know, I'm pretty convinced by some of the writing in that particular article and a couple others that I've been reading, that if this is in fact an actual physical thing where microwaves are bombarding these locations now in 2016 to 2022, that it's the same deal. It's a side effect of signals intelligence gathering by some oppositional force.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, to me, that makes the most sense, that this is like a side effect of those lasery things that they're shooting in to capture phone calls and intel of other kinds. That's the thing that makes the most sense to me. It just doesn't seem like the thing in and of itself is focused enough or has enough of a predictable outcome other than just sowing seeds of discord within the government. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's definitely becoming a bit of a PR nightmare, but that's not enough to be a motive, and it took a long time for it to even come out.
Okay, yeah, you inspired me here. I've got a new conspiracy theory on this. What if it's big ibuprofen, right? Like, they're giving these incredibly important people a lot of headaches to sell. No.
Well, I mean, look, I hear you, Ben, but according to the author, how
many milligrams are in big ibuprofen, by the way?
250. It's crazy. Be careful. But one of the side effects, allegedly, at least according to some of the writing, I can't prove this, of the Moscow Signal was leukemia. And, or theoretically was leukemia. At least it showed up in many people who were affected by the Moscow Signal, including the guy who wrote the article. So I don't know. It's just.
Yeah, that's the pickle here.
Lest we forget about another syndrome, wasn't Agent Orange considered a syndrome?
I believe so, yeah, for a time, because it was a collection, or again, a combo meal of symptoms.
I'm thinking about Gulf War syndrome.
Gulf War
syndrome was another syndrome. Obviously, Agent Orange is now something that people collect disability for, or collect benefits from the VA for. But for a long time, that was buried in the same way. And you got to wonder, as new a story as this is, maybe this is totally our fault.
Oh, yeah, that's an inescapable possibility. There's one more possibility that we need to dive back into, and it's something that I think the majority of opinions you read now will agree with. Doesn't make it correct, but it is important. You do need to know this. What if it is all a case of the made-it-upskis? Everybody involved here is human. They're inherently vulnerable to the usual human misconceptions and frailties. And that's why a growing majority of scientists and skeptics have clapped back at those conclusions by JAMA and those statements from, various politicians and military officials. You can find an example of this reasoning, this argument that Havana syndrome is a result of psychogenic phenomena in a book that was published in March of 2020, March of 2 years ago, Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the Real Story Behind the Embassy Mystery and Hysteria. This can sound offensive to people. If we have people who are in the audience today who know someone who's been affected by this can sound like maybe those authors are ignoring legitimate claims of people who have been injured. This is not the case. Instead, the way I would put it is there is a viable possibility that people were already experiencing various symptoms for any number of unrelated reasons. And upon communicating with people, with their colleagues, their peers, other folks in the area, they heard a phrase that could explain what they were experiencing. They had a name to hang their experience upon. Havana syndrome. You thought you just had some headaches. You thought you just maybe were getting tinnitus. And then someone said, I have a headache too. It's not just a headache, it's Havana syndrome. And then you have that light bulb eureka moment. You say, oh, that's what's happening to me. It is not random. It is not damage from, playing cymbals too loudly or too often. It is Havana syndrome, and we are under attack. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but psychologically, there is a viable possibility, again, especially when you look at how, if you look at the spread of the symptoms for this syndrome, you know what I mean? A lot of them could be caused by other events, and then also a lot of them are tough to verify unless you have doctors in the room at the time doing like brain scans and so on.
Even then, I mean, I just had a health scare with my mom, where we genuinely thought she had a stroke. And we had her in the hospital, and they did a CT scan on her, and they found something that indicated that we were likely right, that she had a stroke. But then they did another scan on her that was totally clean. And any fans of the show Succession will probably remember the episode where Logan Roy, the main character, one of the main characters, appears to be demonstrating stroke-like symptoms. And then it just turns out he had a really bad urinary tract infection, which is a thing that can present those kind of symptoms in older people. So it's just, there's so many factors that can go into these kinds of things, and it's impossible to even like the pain scale that we use to measure people's pain, as we know, if anyone watched that show Dope Sick, or it was followed, the whole Sackler family debacle, we know that was largely invented by pharmaceutical companies. The idea of like, how can you describe your pain on a scale of like 1 to 10 or whatever. It's all very subjective. And I was just going to mention, Ben, you mentioned the made it up skis. Like, couldn't you argue that the initial impetus for some, not all, psychogenic events is a single or a couple of cases of the made it up skis that are so convincing that people just hop on board and believe the hype?
Quite possibly. I mean, it could be a case of retroactive explanation or rationalization. One looks back upon what they've experienced and now has a new frame of reference through which to view it. Again, this is not us saying that it isn't happening. And we want to,
I don't believe it for a second.
First and foremost, we want to be respectful to the people who have experienced these conditions. And this is the opinion of our show, but it's also echoed on a macro stage, on a much larger stage. The debate over what actually went down continues today. Congress and the White House under the Biden administration have also recently passed a bill that set aside funding to assist victims of this syndrome, whatever it turns out to be. And then also the scientists are still clapping back and forth at each other, man. There's an often ignored report from the Jasons on the possibility of a psychogenic illness being at play. There's a redacted version of this that's out now. You can read it online, but essentially they and several other scientists don't agree with those two studies from 2018 and 2019, and they question the methodology. But
what are you hiding, Jasons? What are you trying to hide?
Oh man, we mentioned the Jasons previously, right?
We did either a strange news or a listener mail episode about it. I'll tell you what they're hiding is some really good, sexy heads of hair.
Is that? Oh, you got a picture of them?
No, I just picture them all as being very good-looking boys named Jason.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so.
So, for anybody who doesn't know, and maybe this is a lighter place for us to end today's show. For anybody who isn't aware, the Jasons, technically Jason, is a independent group of top-notch scientists. They formed because the U.S. freaked out when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And they said, okay, no, we can't do this. And in my favorite, like, fictional Tarantino, Wes Anderson version of the story, there's a very off-the-wall presidential meeting, and someone says, we've got to round up everybody named Jason. And someone's like, Mr. President, don't you think that's a bit extreme? And he goes, yeah. No, good point. Just the scientist named Jason. And, but it is a real thing, and they continue today. It was established in 1960. No one's quite sure how many members there are. They are not all named Jason.
I'm just imagining Brian Cox going, Jason, get in here.
There's a dead cat under my chair.
So shout out shout out to the Jasons, a group that still is conducting both classified and declassified research. It's important stuff, and if we're roasting you a little bit about the name, that's just because it's cool. But whatever the case may be with quote unquote Havana syndrome, which again is an unfair term in my opinion, the investigation continues as we record. And this is where you come in, fellow conspiracy realists. We would like to hear from you. What do you think about this? We've outlined the major possibilities. We were able to eliminate one. We found one villain, a Caribbean species of cricket, but now we pass the microwave to you. Is this possible? I don't know. Like, I think all three of us are kind of on the same page here, because outside of the sonic weapon being relatively debunked, the other explanations all have a couple of sticky things about them, things that I think still prevent us from dismissing them entirely. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, look, for my money, it's Moscow Signal 2.0. That's what it is. I don't think it, in my opinion, it doesn't matter I'm just some guy in Georgia. But in my opinion, it was tradecraft, and it's a technology used with that. It's not a weapon. It's a byproduct of that technology being in use.
I tend to lean in the same direction because I do not feel like the ends justified the means. If in fact this technology exists and they are targeting, U.S. diplomats in Cuba, like, to what end? A, we don't have an answer to that, and B, could you do a little bit better job? Like, introduce a little mind control into the equation, something, make them do a thing.
Get a Manchurian candidate.
I was thinking about that too. And again, now I'm not being a jerk here. I do think maybe this is the kind of thing where maybe we only see some symptoms, and maybe there are future symptoms that could be the real thing that actually is the desired end goal of something like this. It just happens that the hand was tipped by these early symptoms. Maybe there is something more nefarious at play. Like, again, we don't have any evidence of that ever actually having successfully taken place throughout the course of human history. I mean, we've got like Sirhan and that kind of stuff, but like it usually involves some level of mental illness on the part of the individual making the claims. But who knows? I mean, maybe there is a deeper layer to this, and now that it's making the news, perhaps whatever party was at play doing that has abandoned it, and they're taking this underground again, and maybe they're gonna tweak their technology so that it doesn't give the game away so quickly. Again, total blue sky sci-fi kind of conjecture there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, let us know what you think, folks. What is this conspiracy of crickets? Is Moscow Signal a better name for an album, or is it a better name for a band? These and other very important questions. We'd love to hear from you. We try to be easy to find online.
That's right. You can find us on the internet in the usual places of note: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. I like to really pronounce that double T in Twitter. I think it really gives it a nice ear feel. You can find us on those platforms under the handle @Conspiracy Stuff. If you want to go to Instagram, you can find us @Conspiracy Stuff Show. There are other non-internet-y ways to get in touch with us as well.
Yes, you can give us a phone call. Our number is 1-833-STDWYTK. When you call in, give yourself a cool nickname. You've got 3 minutes. Say whatever you'd like. We'd love it if you were silly, like Optimus Prime. Thank you again for sending in your message and telling us all about Omicron. Thank you, Optimus. As well as thank you to everybody else who's been calling in. We have two voicemails in our inbox right now, guys. 2. And it's just because they came in while we were recording. So I'm really excited about that state. We're going to do everything we can to keep on that track. So again, our number 1-833-STDWYTK. If you don't want to jump on the phone and you still want to send us some information, links, files, whatever you've got, please shoot us an email. We are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.